welcome back to the NATO Through Time podcast with me once again, Jamie Shea, and it's my pleasure to be the co-host of today's podcast. I'm also delighted to welcome a new co-host appearing on the podcast for the first time, Preston Stewart, who's close to Nashville, Tennessee. So Preston, really delighted to have you with us today. So as it's your first time on the podcast, please introduce yourself briefly and give us a sense of how you're engaged with NATO.
Sounds good, Jamie, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. So again, my name's Preston Stewart. I've spent some time in the U.S. military, commissioning in 2009, a couple of years active duty, currently in the reserve, and I make digital content focused on war and conflict around the world, with a lot of focus right now, obviously, on the war in Ukraine. So I've been very fortunate recently to have been invited out to the 75th anniversary ceremony at NATO headquarters, and then a short visit upon the Charles de Gaulle carrier when they set sail under the NATO banner just late April, early May. So excited to be here, excited to get into this.
Oh, well, welcome, and thanks again for getting up so early in the morning and being with us today. Well, our previous podcasts have been very much focused on the civilian dimension of the alliance, the political consultation mechanisms. It was my pleasure to interview Secretary General Stoltenberg on this recently as well. But of course, anybody who has any knowledge of NATO will know that there is a very significant military dimension to the alliance. The alliance's collective defence clause, Article 5, provides military support to any ally who would be the subject of an armed attack. NATO has developed a very sophisticated military command structure, an integrated command, many regional headquarters, bases, training grounds, and military forces which are interoperable, which have to have the right capabilities, and which have to be exercised and trained to be able to work together. So we cannot have a NATO Through Time podcast series if we leave out this extremely important military dimension. And today we've also got exactly the right person to take us through all of this and to explain to you, dear listeners, how it all works. Lt Gen Hans-Werner Wiermann, who was the Director General of the International Military Staff here at NATO headquarters from 2019 to 2022, and previously occupied a number of senior command positions in the German Bundeswehr and in the German Ministry of Defence. So somebody who is very familiar here at NATO headquarters. And General, welcome back to NATO today. Great to have you on the programme.
Jamie, thank you much for welcoming me, and Preston, thank you for getting up so early to listen to my boring speech. I hope we'll keep you up at least for another hour.
General, it's not going to be boring. That I know for certain. So with those introductions, let's get straight into the substance.
Great. Well, General, very nice to meet you. I had a question about the command structure of NATO. So it's obviously a little bit different, being an alliance and not just a unified command that you might find in the United States, Germany, or elsewhere. Would you be able to walk through what that overall command structure looks like between NATO and the nation's militaries in a time of peace, and how that might change during a time of a war?
Well, the NATO command structure obviously is very, very important and makes a big difference, for example, between a coalition of the willing or an alliance you have described so perfectly as NATO is. So at the very beginning of NATO, after the Washington Treaty was signed in April 1949, the first thing the Allies did was to nominate a Supreme Allied Commander Europe, which was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And it's interesting to see how impact the Asian theater had on NATO already at that moment in time, because it was the Korean War that started in June, which helped to focus the mind in NATO. And it was very important to unify the military command for all allies.
The North Atlantic Council agreed on the establishment of an integrated force at the earliest possible date. The establishing of this integrated force meant first the rearming of nations which had disarmed dangerously far. Beyond that, units from those nations with different languages, different traditions, different ways of life had to be built into a unified armed force. NATO agreed that this could be best achieved by delegating to one man sufficient authority to enable him to organize an Allied command with the least possible delay. On September 26, 1950, the post of Supreme Commander was created. But it was of major importance that the first man appointed to this post should be acceptable to the governments and to the people of all 12 nations. The choice was unanimous. In December 1950, the North Atlantic Council asked the President of the United States to make General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower available for duty as Supreme Commander, Allied Powers, Europe.
For many months, the nations of NATO have been engaged in building for themselves a wall of security. They have no aggressive intent or purpose of their own. They desire only to live in peace behind the defenses that they themselves collectively build to protect their own freedoms, which they themselves have earned. Today, another significant step was taken in this process of building a wall of security. Officially and formally, SHAPE headquarters was opened. Its mission is to take charge of all forces allocated by NATO nations to the business of establishing a collective defense for the freedom, peace, and security of Western Europe.
Of course, there is a difference between national structures and the NATO command structure. I refer to the NATO command structure in the Cold War always as the glue of the alliance. It keeps the military instrument together. In the Cold War, there were some 15,000 officers on a daily basis, 24/7, working together. That created a kind of common NATO alliance spirit. And they came to the NATO command structure and they went back to the national structure. So this was a very, very important element of team building, so to say. And then you have all the technical means. The forces, most of them will always remain under national command and control. We have a number of command and control arrangements. One is full command. Full command covers how do we get the people into the armed forces, how do we equip them. That will always remain a national responsibility. But when it comes to coordinate operations, we have to have unified military command. And therefore, the nations provide forces to the NATO command structure. Some of them are, as we speak, under a NATO operational control for the purpose of setting the theater in Europe. Our forward presence elements, for example, are currently under operational control, while most of the forces remain under national control, but they are prepared in exercises. They are prepared through a lot of standardization activities to be subordinated to Supreme Allied Commander. So when push comes to shove, when we move from peace to a wartime setting, these forces will be subordinated to the Supreme Allied Commander and make up a cohesive force.
General Wiermann, if you wouldn't mind, please, when did you start working with NATO and how did you become DGIMS?
Well, actually, my first experience with NATO was in the middle of the 90s. I was working on conventional arms control on the CFE treaty, which was the flavor of the years in the middle of the 90s, to reduce conventional weapon systems in Europe, which we did quite successfully. So that was my first experience. Then in the Ministry of Defense, I'm responsible for direction and guidance to our representatives here on the military side in NATO. So I worked with NATO topics for a long time. Then I became the German military representative to NATO and the European Union, and that's the same for most of my comrades. They represent their nation at NATO and the European Union in order to maintain the cohesion of both organizations, which is sometimes overlooked. Then you have to be elected to become a Director General of the International Military Staff. And the chiefs of defense have to elect you in one of their meetings. So, yes, you are an equal amongst all the military representatives. They watch you every day. You can't play theater, so you are who you are. They know you for 3 years, and then they give advice to the chiefs of defense whom to elect. And I was happy and lucky to succeed in this election. So that's how you become a Director General of the International Military Staff. Well, one was my last visits as a Director General IMS, and the Director General visits countries that are normally not NATO members. So I visited a lot of very important partners. And in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, I went to Algeria by the end of 2021. And it happened that Sergei Lavrov and I had the same interlocutors. And I was a bit skeptical, but I was very well looked after, particularly by the Chief of Defense. He was a very kind person, and all the protocol was in place. And after we had our meetings the next day, the Algerians came proudly, presented me a newspaper. I made it to the front page. Lavrov was only on page 3.
General, from a public perspective, NATO seems to have a lot of senior military commanders. It's obviously a large alliance, but the public may be a bit confused when they hear about a SACEUR, a Supreme Allied Commander Europe, a SAC-T, a Supreme Allied Commander Transformation on the other side of the Atlantic. There's a Deputy SACEUR, yourself, of course, as the Director General of the International Military Staff, the Chairman of the Military Committee. So could you sort of give a sense of what the individual responsibilities of these individuals are, and frankly, General, do they sort of get on? Do they work together well with so many sort of big military personalities in the alliance?
Well, if you go back into history, be it the First World War, the Second World War, you will read a lot of anecdotes about individuals creating military operation successes and failures. So therefore, the relationship between the individuals is very, very important. And it's absolutely vital that the commanders you have mentioned have a very good individual personal relationship. That's the first thing. Second, I talked about unity of command and the importance, so I cannot come up and say there are 4. No, there's just one for operations, and that's Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He is at the heart of the Allied Command operations. The Supreme Allied Commander Transformation looks into the future. He is very, very important for force planning. His staff is important for the NATO defense planning process. He is looking into the future. What are the capabilities we need in 5 to 10 years' time? So that's what he is looking after. When it comes to current operations, it is the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Then you can look at the chairman of the military committee. The highest military authority in NATO is the military committee. It's the nations. It's not the chair. He is representing the military committee, but it's the military committee representing all chiefs of defense around the table. That is the highest military authority. To put it in one sentence, SACEUR is about operations and the military committee is about war.
You mentioned the role of the military committee to give, I know that you in the military like this expression, unfettered military advice, pure military advice, untainted by political considerations at the beginning on what's feasible, what it's going to take, what the capabilities are. Again, you were at NATO headquarters working every day with the Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, the ambassadors, the North Atlantic Council. How did it all go? Does the relationship work smoothly? Did you in the military committee maybe sometimes feel that you were under sort of political constraints that hindered your work?
Well, Jamie, first of all, unfettered military advice is absolutely essential because you can only define the right political ends if you understand the reality on the battlefield. I mean, just look at what happens in Ukraine. If you don't understand what's happened in the front line, what happens in logistics, you are in a very difficult position to take the right political decisions. So that's important. However, I personally try to talk about unfettered military advice, but politically informed. It's very, very important that we have the understanding on the military side what's going on in the political world in order to draft the right military advice. So it is unfettered military advice, which comes from the strategic commands. But when we put a draft of military advice on top of it, of course, it reflects the political realities. Only if you do that, you can efficiently work in this very complex alliance.
And you feel in general that after that sort of ping pong of military advice, political views, military advice then being adapted, NATO manages nonetheless to come out with a coherent sort of strategy that makes sense?
Well, I think NATO has shown many, many times that it comes up, if it's necessary, with a coherent strategy or a very coherent concept of operations. That's not to say that sometimes issues that are not that urgent take a very long time. So one of the skills of a Director General probably is to identify the issues which have to be on the table for discussions and the documents which can be put into the refrigerator to wait for better political climate. Just to go not too much into detail, because it's still probably sensitive, but we had discussions about graduated response plans. They were developed actually in the aftermath of 2014, when Russia illegally invaded Crimea. Then the question was, what can we do militarily? And the concept was called graduated response plans. And it was very difficult to find consensus on all these graduated response plans because there were political sensitivities, geographical sensitivities, very understandable things. But I have to say, when Putin invaded Ukraine, the North Atlantic Council within hours agreed to implement all graduated response plans like this. And I signed almost within 24 hours on behalf of the military committee the activation of all graduated response plans. This shows NATO is complex, but it can act very swiftly if it's necessary.
So you have to do the homework, and then when the crisis comes, the product is ready to go.
Something we hear often today is an argument about the expansion of NATO. And I think something that's often missed in that window is that there's a lot of countries kind of wanting to join and are kind of being attracted to the idea that NATO stands for. So I was interested in your thoughts on what was it like in Germany, in the German military, as that conversation was coming about, the possibilities of joining NATO?
Well, I would say it was very much a political debate, first and foremost, in Germany. Remember, we were just a few years away from the Second World War. Germany was responsible for two catastrophes in the last century, the First World War, the Second World War. Germany was cut into four pieces, occupied by the Allied powers. And it was very difficult because of German history for the Germans to identify with a nation state. It was easier, and that makes a big difference to others in Europe. It was more easy for a German citizen to identify with Europe, for example, because that was much more untainted than the German national approach. That's a general observation. So first, the Soviet Union still occupied the eastern part of Germany, and the Soviet army at that time was huge. And of course, there was the threat that the Communist Party would try to expand into Western Europe. So for Adenauer, the chancellor at that time, membership in NATO had at least two impacts. One was it brought Germany, West Germany, at least back to the table of equal nations. And secondly, it created conditions to successfully defend Western Europe. Remember, if the Soviet Union had decided to attack Western Europe, the battlefield would have been West Germany. So for West Germans, NATO was a gift. On the one hand, we got the capabilities to defend successfully our country, Western Germany, and at the same time it brought us back on the table as an equal nation amongst others.
It was at one of these ministerial meetings in the spring of 1955 that press and delegates welcomed the chief representative of a new member nation, Dr. Konrad Adenauer, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. With this nation taking her place, the 14 became 15, and Western unity was immeasurably strengthened.
Well, why did you choose to become a soldier in the Bundeswehr? Was it because of the sort of geopolitical reasons that you've just very eloquently outlined for us, or was it maybe a little bit more practical that you wanted a kind of particular sort of training? Was NATO part of that sort of initial decision to become a soldier, or was it just something that you discovered later on as you progressed through the ranks of the German Bundeswehr?
Well, I did not enter the armed forces to become a general, that's for sure. That would be a little bit too ambitious. At the same time, geography matters. I grew up in Lower Saxony, and a very important NATO live-firing training area, Bergen-Hohne, was very close by. I grew up in a house which was about 100 meters from the live-firing area Münster Süd. Artillery shells were flying over our house frequently, and my parents owned a piece of land which was leased to the German government and was the live-firing position number 20. I vividly remember. So therefore, my professional choices were somewhat limited. Looking at the wider strategic picture, the inner German border was just 40, 50 kilometers away. So you could walk and you could see not only the border forces of GDR, but also the Soviet forces.
Yeah.
And we had still the Soviet military mission following NATO live exercises. So geopolitics was very much around me, very practically. And therefore, it was a very obvious decision to join the armed forces. Of course, there was an element of, I wanted to become an engineer, which sounds strange when you look back at my career. But at that time, I wanted to become an electrical engineer, which I did. And the Federal Armed Forces provided the opportunity for officers to study during their active duty time. And then over time, you learn more, you get more experience, then you decide deliberately to join, to stay, to become a professional.
You know, in 1989, the wall comes down. I was at NATO working for Manfred Werner, a great German Secretary General of NATO. And everybody thought that was it. You know, peace was going to break out. I remember Der Spiegel had a cover saying, you know, we don't need the Bundeswehr any longer because obviously, you know, Europe is now a peaceful place. Did you think at the time, you know, in sort of just in the middle of your Bundeswehr career that you might have to look for another job?
No, not seriously. I mean, I heard the political discussions as well. And there's this famous book from Fukuyama, The End of History. So rationality will win the day. So everybody will become a Democrat. It's just not a question of if, it's just a question of when. Yes, that was all around us. I personally at that time was at Hamburg at the Führungsakademie and at the end of the General Staff Officers course. And I have to say I was absolutely surprised by what happened in Berlin when the wall came down. I saw it on TV, and first I thought this is a kind of documentary. It's not real. So that was the mood of the time. And then, of course, my father-in-law has roots in East Germany, so he told me, well, you won't believe it, the border is open, I can drive to Dresden, people from Dresden are coming, huge queues of trubbies crossing the border. So that was the overall situation. As a general staff officer, you ask yourself, what does it all mean for the armed forces? No question. First, it was clear there was no enemy anymore. The Soviet Union was more or less not an enemy. We had a lengthy process, but a very successful process of 300,000 Soviet soldiers withdrawing peacefully from East Germany. So yes, why do you need armed forces? It's a fair question. The discussion took us a while, and then we were taught by developments on the Balkans that peace was not there forever and violence had not gone. People were killing each other at large scale on the Balkans. Srebrenica, a very cruel incident happened on our doorsteps. I remember when I was at the 1st German Armored Division, housing for the migrants fleeing Yugoslavia. And at the latest then, it was clear that peace had not won the day and that you need armed forces to maintain the peace.
Yeah, so it was good for NATO and your subsequent role as DGIMS that you decided to stay and not leave the Bundeswehr in 1990.
This large-scale war occurring in Ukraine. I'm sure you can talk about what you've seen, what you've learned, what your takeaways are for a long, long time. But if you had to dial it down to a few major lessons for NATO and the militaries of the alliance, what direction would you take that?
Well, first of all, I would, for the time being, divide the Russian campaign in Ukraine started in 2022 in two parts. First, the attempt to quickly occupy Kiev, to have a very short war, to chase the government away and to replace it by a government that's friendly to Putin. That went terribly wrong for the Russians. And why? And we were surprised ourselves because we compared numbers. We compared numbers of equipment. What we had not in our equation, the human factor. So it makes a big difference whether you are defending your own country or whether you are moved from the eastern parts of Russia into unknown territory, dropped and then told, now win the war. So I think that's the key lesson of the first phase of this campaign, the importance of motivation of the human factor in a war. Now we come to the second phase, which again is more technical in character. You see the importance of drones, of sensors. So what we see is a battlefield that becomes very, very transparent, and a battlefield that's an absolute range of a lot of very precise weapon systems that can attack very precisely targets from 10 kilometers away, 20 kilometers away, or even 100 kilometers away. This has serious consequences for future plans and for future force and capability development inside NATO. Are we at the end of the story? No, we are not. So I would be careful to finalize the chapters, lessons learned from Ukraine, because there might very well be a third phase and a fourth phase. We don't know, but we have to observe it very closely. One more critical remark from my side is we are giving a lot of equipment to Ukraine, ammunition in particular, but also weapon systems. That's absolutely vital.
Are we leaving ourselves bare in the NATO militaries because of these transfers?
I personally believe that's absolutely right what we do. Honestly, the Ukrainians are fighting our war, and we can and should give them whatever we can to succeed in this campaign against Russia, which is not easy, but it is doable because they are defending their own country. And if our support is unwavering, I think the Ukrainians have a very good chance to win, whatever win means, because at the end will be a political process. There is no question, but they can succeed. Coming back to the lessons, so when we send equipment and shells and tanks, we should not take the decision to replace everything one by one in our inventory. We should have a very close look on what happens on the battlefield, and we should take a little bit of breath and then think, what are the weapon systems, what are the sensors, what in particular is the command and control architecture, multi-domain operation impact we have to consider when we look at new capabilities and new weapon systems. I think that's very important. Don't spend money one-on-one on the same equipment. Look at the battlefield.
That's an interesting observation because the press reporting is always about restocking and replacement. Now, that's a very interesting observation.
General, in recent months, some senior military figures from NATO allies have made pretty bold statements about the possibility of war in the coming years. Is NATO preparing for the possibility of a future war with Russia?
As Preston says, even the current chairman of NATO's military committee, Admiral Rob Bauer, has evoked this possibility that we might have to be ready for war in 5 or 10 years. And that's been echoed by many other defence ministers and generals.
Well, there are two things. First is this sentence, which goes back many 100 years. If you want to have peace, prepare for war. So I think the overall political strategic end of NATO has not changed. We are a peaceful alliance, and we want to maintain peace for our 1 billion citizens. So that's the absolute priority. But sometimes, as the people said in the past, if you want to have peace, prepare for war. So I think I would put what the chairman said and others say in this category: prepare for war in order to maintain peace. That's one angle. The other angle is it will very much depend on the outcome in Ukraine. My personal view is, as I said, the Ukrainians are fighting our war. If Russia, and Putin in particular, succeeds in Ukraine, he will not stop there. And that's the argument why we should look into options in 5, 6, 7 years' time, when Russia, building on the vast experience it's currently getting on the battlefield, and obviously it's not so bad at adapting to the new challenges, and if equipped with this experience and capabilities developed from that experience, then we may face a dire situation which resembles the situation in the early 50s. So therefore, I understand that people say we have to prepare for war, but you should never forget the priority: maintain peace, and therefore you have to prepare sometimes for war.
Of course, you've had this long career, not just at NATO, but in the Bundeswehr. Been a lot of attention on the Bundeswehr, this special fund of 100 billion euros that the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, agreed with the Bundestag for the modernisation, the German military taking on now this big role in Lithuania. How do you sort of see the modernisation of the Bundeswehr going, and what its role is now in NATO's new posture of conventional defence?
Well, Bundeswehr. I think the famous speech of Chancellor Scholz in the German Bundestag, when he created and coined the phrase Zeitenwende, was very important, not only for German armed forces, but I think also for the whole mindset in Europe, how to approach the situation, which was very much unforeseen when Russia attacked Ukraine. 100 million is a lot of money, no question, and it's absolutely vital that the money is invested in weapon systems, new capabilities. We come from an era of crisis management. We had forces in Afghanistan. The challenge was to sustain a low-intensity operation, sometimes high-intensity, but locally, for a long period of time. That leads to different structures in comparison to the need to prepare for high-intensity warfare where you need all hands on deck. That's a fundamentally different military structure and fundamentally different military capabilities. So it's a mindset issue, and that takes time. So you need the money, you need a mindset change, and you need the organizational changes. And it's not easy, because in the Cold War we could focus on collective defense. Crisis management didn't play a big role outside of NATO. It was dangerous but very clear. Then we had the era of crisis management, which took us to the Balkans, where we still are, to Afghanistan and other places. And now, since 2014, I would say, we are what I call a two-dimensional NATO. We have to look at high-intensity warfare in case Putin wins in Ukraine. And we have at the same time look at crisis management. So we are still on the Balkans. So it's a two-dimensional NATO. And
the old problems don't go away simply because you have new ones.
The old problems don't go away. And this requires different capabilities. And different nations will go for different capabilities, either on the high-end spectrum, high-intensity warfare, or on crisis management. And geography matters. So it's not a surprise that I think most of the southern allies would focus more on crisis management. While look at Germany's geography. We are the center for movements of allied forces. We are a key provider of conventional power to defend our eastern allies. So that's the role of Germany. And that will cost a lot of money, and that will cost a lot of time. But we have a window. We talked about 5 to 6 years, maybe it's longer. But we have to use it. That's the situation in Germany. Money's
good, but you have to spend it on the right things, spend it wisely. I'm almost out of time, General. So just a couple of thoughts on why did NATO set up a coordination cell on critical undersea infrastructure? Is it in danger? Is it threatened?
Well, first of all, we have seen the incidents. We have seen the Nord Stream event, and the investigations are still ongoing. The outcome is still unclear, I would say. Then we had the Baltic Connector incident, so obviously something is happening on our critical undersea infrastructure. It's not a surprise. Russia has continued to spend money on two strategic programs, even during the time between the end of the Cold War and 2014. That's the nuclear program, and you can read what they achieved there every day. And it's the Russian undersea reconnaissance program. So they have to continue to invest in this capability to affect our critical undersea infrastructure. Russia has a hybrid strategy. Putin knows that an overall strategic conflict cannot be won by Russia. Compare the numbers, no chance. But a hybrid strategy that remains below the threshold of conventional warfare may well succeed. You have seen a lot of cyber attacks. And that's a space where you can do a lot of harm and get away with it being not identified. And the undersea domain is very similar. You can do a lot of harm to our critical undersea infrastructure and get away with it. That fits into the hybrid strategy of Russia. So we better prepare. And our final goal, our vision is to identify suspicious behavior in the vicinity of critical undersea infrastructure in real time in order to deter Russia from meddling with our critical undersea infrastructure. Yeah. And it becomes more and more important. The green energy transition will take place mainly at sea. If you look at the North Sea, you will get much more critical undersea infrastructure. So that's a very important point why I think NATO is absolutely right to develop capabilities and to focus the mind also on critical undersea infrastructure.
Well, you sound as if you were very much the right person for that job as well, General. General Wiermann, I could be here for many hours if you could as well, talking to you, because you're obviously a treasure trove of insights and information and experience. What I always like about interviewing military personalities is the military speak frankly. Klartext, as you say in German, and you've certainly done that today. So, look, thank you very much for being our guest. It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for taking the time. Very much enjoyed this conversation.
Again, General Wiermann, thank you for being our special guest today and for sharing your experience and insights with us. All right, General, many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Okay, all the best.
Well, Preston, we had a good round of discussion there with General Wiermann. What did you make of it? I mean, what did he say that sort of particularly struck you?
NATO is so complex, and there's so many moving parts to have the military and the political aspect from multiple member states. And when we asked him about that, he explained it as, well, we just get it done and you just make it happen. One of the reasons there is that the military aspect of you just accomplish the mission, you get it done. But I think it's very hard to articulate how challenging the day in and day out of keeping that many, they have a unified mission, but also very, very different interests from one country to another. And I think it's very hard to appreciate just how challenging that job is.
Yeah, that struck me as well, Preston. It's interesting. We had exactly the same reaction there because he described sort of three sets of very complex relationships. On the first hand, he's got to talk to all of those other senior NATO generals in the system, the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation, his own boss, the chairman of the military committee, and so on, get everybody on board. Then he's got to speak to the chiefs of defence of the 32 NATO individual member countries who all have their own national positions, even if they're military. And then when they've done that coordination, they've got to take it to the political side of the House with the ambassadors and the Secretary General and coordinate there. What did you think about what he said about the impact of the war in Ukraine on NATO strategy?
I liked how he broke it out from the phase 1 to the phase 2. So the kind of key takeaways, the assessments of the Ukrainian military strength tied to their morale and their desire to defend their own territory, and how it's very, very difficult to measure that. And I thought that was important to separate that out as a key aspect of how we're looking at this war, what we're learning from this war, from the technological piece and the strategy and the tactics on the battlefield that we're seeing play out now. So, it's so easy to get all these intermixed and kind of focus on the recent. So if he would have just said drones and artillery and air defense, it would have been understandable because that's the conversation right now. But I like that he split it out and said phase one, a major portion was that morale piece, that desire to fight. I think it was important to separate those.
Yeah, I also was struck by what he said about when money is available to replace the weapons, the many weapons that NATO countries have sent to help Ukraine, we shouldn't necessarily replace a shell with a shell or a tank with a tank, but spend the money maybe on some more modern capabilities that NATO really needs, because so much of the media attention is that's exactly what it is. It's restocking. You replace a shell with a shell. That really set me thinking. I have to think a lot more about that. But anyway, Preston, I think we both agree that he was a good person to have as our guest today. He gave us a lot. And hopefully, dear audience, you agree that it was an interesting podcast. Preston, couldn't have done it without you, man. So many, many thanks indeed for being up so early. Hopefully we can do it again before too long, perhaps at a more civilized hour for you. We'll have to wait and see. But thanks again for being my co-host today. And all the best.
Thank you, Jamie. You as well.
Thank you all, dear listeners, as always, for following the NATO Through Time podcast. Hope you're enjoying them as much as we're enjoying recording them. And of course, more will follow with other Alliance personalities, past and present, in the next few weeks.